Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly webcast dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's the founder of the Schiller Institute and the chairwoman of the organization. It's April 20th, 2022, and it appears as though we're moving into a new phase in the situation in Ukraine with the Russians on the move. But importantly, what is missing in the media is an alternative to war and chaos. But that was the subject of the Schiller Institute conference on April 9th on convening a new conference to establish a new security and financial architecture. Quite an extraordinary conference. And I think, Helga, it's worth getting your impression of it to people because this was really something that, in the absence of anyone else talking about solutions, we provided solutions.
Yes, I think this conference does represent a real breakthrough because we have put on the agenda in a very serious way the idea that we need a new international security and development architecture which must take into account the interest of every single nation on the planet. And that includes emphatically Russia, China, and all the other nations in the world. Now, we were able to make that visible by the combination of speakers who we assembled. We had, very importantly, the first diplomat of Russia in the United States, Ambassador Antonov, who made a very important speech. And, I think this is really important because he expressed very clearly the importance he gave to the Schiller Institute as providing a platform for such discussion. Then we had many important speakers, one of the co-organizers was Sam Petroda, who is a very known Indian. He was an advisor to the Rajiv Gandhi government, and he's very known as an inventor in the IT branch in India. He spoke about the absolute need for having a complete redesign of the world in the tradition of the non-aligned movement. Then we had Mr. Naidu, Jay Naidu, who was a minister in the Mandela government, who also brought in the view of the non-aligned movement, and many, many other top speakers. And I would advise you to go to the Schiller website. You can download there a 30-minute video with short segments of all the speeches, and that gives you an impression. Naturally, we presented solutions, the idea to have a new international security architecture in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia. And then we provided the kind of programmatic solution for a new world economic order based on development with very concrete proposals. And I think this is really important because, you have now all kinds of people, commenting on the situation in Ukraine, more weapons, more this, more that. But, what is most needed is an organization, an institution which actually thinks of how do we end this war? Because, you have the warmongers like the Senator Coons from the United States, from Delaware, who is advocating US weapons on the ground in Ukraine, which is a clear suicide idea of bringing the world to World War III as quickly as possible. You have all these people like Borrell from the EU, von der Leyen, and unspeakable people I don't even want to start characterizing because I get really extremely emotional about it, who say more weapons, more weapons. The war, Russia must be prevented from winning the war. What does that mean? It means, that you fight the war until the last Ukrainian or until World War III. So, I think we need a radical, different approach, namely that, we have to get to the negotiation table. The war has to end. Any more hour the war continues is only, at the disadvantage of the Ukrainian people. And then we have to have a real architecture which allows a solution. And that is what our conference provided. And I can only encourage you to take the time one evening or one weekend and look at the whole program, because you will find an amazing combination of people agreeing with this approach. And we do not intend to stop with this conference, but we are expanding the process of building an alliance of people who want to have a new paradigm.
And what's clear is if you want to have such an event occur, you need to have a very diverse group of speakers who come from different countries, different continents, but share a common agreement that we can't continue in the direction that we're going. I think one of the interesting indications of the power of the event was the article in Politico, which talked about the isolation of the Russian ambassador Antonov, but then noted that he spoke at the Schiller conference.
Yes, I think the establishment is trying to isolate Russia, but we gave Ambassador Antonov a platform which is not only reaching a lot of people inside the United States, but internationally. So they were probably, I don't know if they were more freaked out about Ambassador Antonov or about the Schiller Institute, but in any case, it's good that they are worried.
Well, and one of the other indications that they're worried was this article that will be in the Economist magazine on April 22nd, which talks about the realignment and talks about something that you repeatedly bring up, that there are more people in more countries who are opposing the Anglo-American war drive than are supporting it. And I think this is quite interesting that this came out. And at the same time, we're seeing finally some people who are providing proper analysis of what's going on militarily. Jacques Bowie, you mentioned, from the Swiss intelligence, Mal Brunet, a French reporter. Why don't you give us a sense of where you think this battle in the inside battle in Ukraine is headed?
Well, I mean, what people should be aware of is that what nowadays is called fake news, that has been part of any warfare since millennia. When you have a war, then, each side develops their narrative and they're trying to, demoralize the other side and remoralize their own ranks. And, that makes it very difficult for people who believe in the news of the day, because the news of the day is what is the result of this information war, which the Rand Corporation and many other think tanks, they have spent enormous studies on how to make the information war an integral part of war fighting. And therefore, it is very important that now more and more real military experts are coming out and they give pieces, of what leads to the truth. For example, this Jacques Beau, who is a Swiss security expert, he actually provided some information which already came from Russian sources before, but he is now, from a Swiss standpoint, confirming it, that what really started the war was not the 24th of February with the Russian military invasion in Ukraine, but that from the 17th of February onward, the Ukrainian army had increased by 30 times the attacks on the Donbas, shelling and artillery and various other military action, so that Putin finally was convinced that that was the offensive and there was no other way than to engage in the combat as it occurred. Then you have another important security expert, Mal Bruno, who writes for the Figaro, who said that he came just back from the front in Ukraine, and he saw it with his own eyes, that British SAS and US Delta forces were in command of the fighting in Ukraine. Now, these are all very important informations you don't get when you just read the newspaper or listen to the TV news, but it really shows that this is a war which has a completely different dimension. It's not what the media say, the madman Putin, who all of a sudden decided to conquer first Ukraine and then the rest of Europe. This is a completely different story. It is a war between those forces led by the British and the United States, who have turned actually Europe into vassals, who are trying to maintain an unipolar world by conducting economic warfare against Russia, and in a certain sense China is on the list, who want to prevent what they call a multipolar world. But the reality is this unipolar world does not exist anymore. It is gone. And what these media coverages completely are hiding is that there have been changes taking place, as President Xi Jinping always says these days, as they have not occurred since 100 years. And this is indeed very remarkable, because what the sanctions against Russia have done in the very short period of time since the war started, they have forced Russia to completely reorientate. The partnership with China is being strengthened, but also India, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, Pakistan, all of these countries do not want to choose. So half of the African countries have refused to take sides. There was supposed to be a meeting of 10 South Asian countries, which the United States named to be a top priority to take place. This has been postponed indefinitely for the same reason. So you have some few countries who side with the United States, like Japan. The new prime minister, or relatively new prime minister, Kishida, just copied the sanctions of the United States and applied them to Russia, and that way ruining the relationship between Japan and Russia, which had been built over many years by Prime Minister Abe before. So that's the only real change in the direction of the United States. But you have a complete reorientation. For example, if you look at the situation, the United States has lost practically all influence in the Middle East. You have Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, other countries who are really orienting more in the direction of working, with the SCO, with the BRICS. The BRICS themselves are being revitalized. The relationship between Russia and India. India is refusing to bend to the pressure to break a relation with Russia. A new currency is developing. But the sanctions and the trust in the dollar is disappearing to the extent that the US is confiscating the assets of other countries. They did it with Afghanistan with 9 billion. Then they did it with 300 billion of Russia. Now, many countries say maybe it's not so safe to keep your assets in dollars, and they're moving to have more trade in the national currencies. And that naturally is developing into a de-dollarized alternative financial system. Now, these are all changes which are caused uniquely by the policy of the West. And that is, a backlash which people are not thinking about. I mean, this is a complete destruction of the world order which existed in the post-war period, or even in the post-Soviet Union era. And there is a complete change. And, that should be the discussion. How do we find a solution, which prevents that this multipolarity goes into a new geopolitical confrontation and ends with World War III? And that's what we try to discuss with our conference.
Well, while we're seeing these changes around the world, which are quite visible if you know where to look, we're seeing the same line coming out still from the NATO forces. Biden promising more weapons, Ursula von der Leyen, Josep Borrell constantly saying we need more weapons, and saying openly that there is no intention to end the war. This is part of the situation that's emerging, which is causing the realignment, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I think the attitude of these people you named, Borrell, von der Leyen, Röttgen, this FDP woman, Strack-Zimmermann. I mean, these are like hawks, who seem to have only one thing in mind: to, drive Russia into bankruptcy, to, completely turn Europe into a militarized union, a military union. But this is not the future. I think that the West right now is in such a collapse. And if you look at the inflation figures, I mean, they were on the rise before, but now you have a situation of inflation in producer prices in Germany in March, more than 30%, energy almost 85%. You have a famine in the world. And, if people think that, this situation can be settled with weapons and with military means, I think that the countries I named before, the countries assembling around China, India, Russia, they, they have a completely different orientation and, make friends by addressing the questions which are of concern to them: infrastructure, food, medicine, and these things. And I think the West is really on a wrong footing by thinking that they can bully people into, agreeing to the value-based order of the Western liberal model, which, people start to think through. I mean, I got reports today that even in Germany, people, you meet in information tables and other occasions, they have second questions because the war propaganda does not function. And, for example, the Pope basically said that the way how the West is treating the refugees as a two-class system, where the Ukrainian refugees are being, given everything they need, but the other dark color refugees are being treated like nobody. I mean, I got reports that in Germany, some of the refugee facilities where Afghan refugees were living in parts since 5 years, and they were just settling down, finding a job, learning the language, adjusting their job their job justification their qualification to the German system, so they could really start to build up an existence. They are being kicked out right now to make room for the Ukrainians. This is terrible for these people from Afghanistan, because what have they gone through? So, when the Pope says this is racism, I think that does not get stay unnoticed. And, there is right now a discussion that the conflict in the world is not between democracies and so-called autocratic states, but it is between the former colonial powers and those countries who were victims of that colonial system, and they do not want to have that system any longer. So there is a complete misrepresentation on what are the actual questions of importance in the world for the majority of people. And I think it's backfiring big. Unfortunately, it does not backfire only on the elites, so-called elites in the transatlantic world, but it also hits the populations of those countries as well.
Now, you mentioned this fight between the colonial system and those nations that were part of the non-aligned, the anti-colonial movement. One of the battlegrounds for this that you're very familiar with is India, where you had the efforts by Biden to talk to Modi to bring him online with the sanction policy against Russia. You had Blinken, you have all sorts of State Department officials, and now Boris Johnson's headed there. But it seems as though what we're seeing from India is an assertion of independence, non-alignment, and willing to work toward this new financial system. And this brings up the whole question of your husband's idea of the four powers. I wonder if you'd like to say something about that.
Yeah, my husband was convinced for a very long time that this is not a battle among nations. This is between the oligarchy, the financial powers in the city of London and Wall Street, and you could add Silicon Valley to that, and the interest of the people. So, it's not between the United States and Russia or even Europe. It's really this question of oligarchy versus the common good. And that is why he said that you needed a powerful combination of countries who could resist the pressures from this oligarchy. And he at the time said that it should be a combination of Russia, China, and India. This was the famous strategic triangle, which was developed by Prime Minister Primakov, who basically developed that as a counter to the policies coming from the United States and the British at that time. But my husband emphatically said it should include the United States, and the United States should work with these countries because you need a solution for the world. And unfortunately right now that does not seem very likely at this point, because Biden is on the confrontation. He was one of the architects of the NATO expansion. He was the point person for the Obama administration in the Ukraine developments also in 2014. And it is very interesting that the former Joint Chief of Staff of Italy, General Bartolini, I hope I have that right, in any case, what this general basically said is that, if Hillary Clinton would have won the election in 2016, the war against Ukraine would have happened now. And interestingly, he also said that given the fact that the entire Black Sea surveillance and military operations are conducted from Sicily, I think the airbase is called Sigorella, he thinks that the US drones had a big role in the sinking of the Russian Moskva cruiser, which, if it would be true, is really very close to crossing the red lines, because it would involve military involvement of the United States, and we could have a war between Russia and NATO and the US very, very quickly, because these red lines are permanently, if not crossed, that then gotten very close to. But I think this is all a question of, can we mobilize enough people inside the United States and in Europe who understand that the only outcome of such a policy is World War III. And hopefully, what is happening de facto right now is that the strategic triangle, Russia, China, India, and all the other countries I had named before, they are moving already into an alternative system. And the big question is, can we convince enough thinking people in the United States in particular, but also in European nations, to, understand that, we have to live together in 100 years from now. The idea to crush Russia, this obsession, can only lead to the destruction of all of humanity. And we have to find people who are willing to say, we have so many problems. We have world famine. We have an epidemic which is not finished. We have a collapsing transatlantic financial system. Why don't we work together and develop the future of humanity, which I'm sometimes surprised that there are not more people in the so-called advanced sector, which is not so advanced at all anymore, who are not giving it some thought that you have to think in terms of how to shape the future, and not just follow your hatred and your Russophobia and your xenophobia. And I really appeal to you to look at our conference and give it a second thought, if it's not a better idea to choose diplomacy and to choose negotiation, and find a way where we all can live together on this planet.
And one of the common bases in moving in this direction is for Americans to remember that the American Revolution was an anti-colonial movement and that it was supported by a number of European countries that wanted to put an end to the British Empire at the end of the 18th century. And this seems to be something that people have forgotten in the mobilization to crush Russia. Now, this brings me to a question I get from a lot of people some of whom saw the conference and now are saying, well, where do we go from here? How do we get this international conference to convene to set up a new strategic and financial architecture? So, Helga, what are the plans ahead for doing this besides people watching the video and spreading it and making sure that others are brought on board?
Well, first of all, we have to build this process as a real movement. We have to do outreach. We have to make sure that this conception is becoming known, preferably to all parliaments of all nations on the world, to all think tanks, to all university faculties. And then we will basically try to catalyze the initiation of such a conference, which naturally must be done by governments. And, I'm absolutely convinced that, as the situation will become more tumultuous, and it will, I mean, we are heading towards, look at the United States, which is completely polarized. There is such a discrepancy between what the average person has as their interest. Look at the farmers, look at the truckers, look at the various groups of people, the medical profession. What the establishment, especially Wall Street, is prescribing is not the interest of the American people. In the same way, the present total capitulation you see in Germany, or I would not say total, but 95% capitulation you see in Germany. I mean, Germany is selling out all its interest. Look at what they did with Nord Stream 2. This is absolutely the existential interest of Germany, to have energy security by importing gas from Russia. Now it's given up. Now they are making a witch hunt against anybody whoever had the idea of positive relations with Russia, or at least diplomatic relations with Russia, is being absolutely ostracized, and there are calls for their ouster, like this infamous Röttgen, is now demanding that the minister president of I think it's Sachsen. No, I'm sorry, Schleswig, that she be ousted simply because she was in favor of Nord Stream 2. And this kind of a witch hunt is really not expressing the interest of the German people. The security interest of Germany is not to be separated from Russia. This was the expressed policy goal of the United States for 100 years or longer. This has been stated by several strategists in the United States, that the long-term strategy of the United States is to separate Germany and Russia. And they have practically succeeded in doing that. Is that the interest of Germany? No, absolutely not. Who knows what will happen in the French election this coming Sunday? If Marine Le Pen wins, we could have a completely different situation, because she says, there must be a rapprochement between Europe and Russia, which is right. Unfortunately, she is anti-Chinese and wants to split Russia and China, which is again falling into the trap of geopolitics. But we are in for a turmoil, and people should not think that we get through this year without major dramatic developments, the inflation going out of control, the famine having social effects all over the world. So the demand for our approach, for a conference in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia, will grow. And hopefully, we will be able to put it on the table for good, which means, that it has to be evoked by a majority of the governments of the world.
Well, those of you who wish to be a part of this, I would recommend two steps. First, go to the schillerinstitute.com and watch the April 9th conference. Study it, pass it around, and discuss it. And then secondly, join the Schiller Institute. We are building a movement. We are pulling together people from every continent, from every country. And we're talking about the real thinkers, the people who can move the population around these more profound ideas. Because what Helga just laid out is a profound idea, changing the direction from utter destruction into a potential for a new paradigm. So Helga, anything else you want to add?
No, I think, try to be inner directed, try to become a truth seeking person. Don't fall for the narratives which are trying to be sold to you, but do some work, do some history studying, find out what was the prehistory of this war in the Ukraine. Start with what happened in 1990. With the promises given to Gorbachev not to extend NATO to the east. This is not a narrative by Russia. This did happen. We have documented it. There are many people, Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, is on the tape. You can listen to these things, but spend some time to become an independent thinker. I think that is the most important. And then you will end up automatically with us.
Well, in this year of LaRouche, being an independent thinker is the best thing one can do. So Helga, thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you again soon.
Hopefully next week.